Hello, my name is Jonathan Barrett. I'm the Galloway Glens Land Management and Access Officer, and we're here today to walk 4.5 miles of the relatively newly restored Pack Road, which is a prehistoric road which probably dates back to Neolithic times, judging by the amount of Neolithic and Bronze Age architecture. So it's probably originally a prehistoric ridgeway. But it goes through a landscape that shows real change. You know, changes in landscape ownership after the First World War, changes in agriculture, forestry, and its impact on transport in the area as well. So it's a very historic route with a lot of archaeological interest along its course, and culminates in the abandoned farm town of Polmaddy, which is probably the best surviving example of a farm town in southwest Scotland. So all in all, a very varied walk through some really interesting landscape. So, right, let's set off. The first thing I want to show you, we're going to have a quick look at the War Memorial, which is this way. So this is a recently installed plaque which commemorates Lieutenant Colonel William Clark Kennedy, who was I think he was born in this area, but he was actually awarded the Victoria Cross. So yeah, he was one of the residents in this area. There's another little plaque there, and we've also on here we've got a Captain A. Cathcart. And the Cathcart-McAdam family were a notable local family. I think it was Captain Cathcart's father, Captain Cathcart-McAdam, who founded or who developed the Woodhead mine, which you can't see. Oh yes, if you were stood higher up, you would be able to look over the top. Wander up here and have a look. I think one of the lovely things about these sort of memorials is that it's about remembrance. Everybody probably should just look at them and read at least one name, and then these folk are remembered. So if we look directly behind the monument, you'll see that patch of white from the building in the trees. If you carry on just to the right up the hillside, you'll see a tall pointy thing, a dark pointy thing. That's one of the original chimneys from the Woodhead lead mine. And we get a better view from on top. But that was a settlement that was developed in the 1830s by Cathcart-McAdam. And there's some vague relation to McAdam, the road building technologists as well. But he developed a lead mine up there, which at one stage employed 300 people. There was a schoolhouse, there was a library, there was an institute. 300 people lived and worked up there. It only lasted about 35 years, but again, it was another aspect of how this landscape changed, how it's become more or less active over time. So yeah, it was a thriving industrial complex by the standards of its day up there. So this is the start of the path. You get a slightly better view of the Woodhead lead mine site now. And we're stood in the midst of a typical Galloway Hill farm. This is a farm of about 500 acres with a few hundred sheep and a small herd of Highland Cross cattle. And this is a sort of lovely example of how this landscape's changed. After the First World War, these sort of areas were part of big landowner estates, and they were mostly just run as shooting estates with a bit of agriculture, a few tenant farmers scraping a living. After the First World War, the estates lost a huge amount of their labour, and there were a lot of land sales in the 1920s, which was the opportunity for a lot more people to buy land and start, farming on their own account, which is how the family who owns this farm started in the 1920s. And it's not an easy way to earn a living, because it's a bit rough up here in winter, and keeping your stock alive as well can be a challenge at times. But it persists, and I think one of the biggest threats to agriculture in this area is forestry. To be brutal about it, because it allows somebody to just walk away from a hard life with a pot of money, and somebody else will come and plant an awful lot of Sitka spruce on it. Which I've got a map in the car which I was going to show you before we set off, but I'll show you when we get back, which shows this area, Carsphairn and west, in 1905, and little tiny patches of woodland marked on it, old woodland. No forestry at all in 1905. It was only the perceived threat from the First World War blockading supplies of timber into the country that sent government. Government got very enthusiastic about timber as a strategic resource and about growing its own, essentially. The Forestry Commission was brought into being, and a lot of the smaller. The nearest example here is Dunduk, which is just down the road where the turn into Polmaddy is, which was a forestry village. The Forestry Commission must have been a lovely organisation to work for at one time, because there was housing, villages, village halls, and everything provided as part of the job. So forestry forestry comes in phases. After the First World War, there was a lot of tree planting. There was a lot of tree planting in the 1950s, and there's a lot going on now. It's linked to the life cycle of a Sitka spruce, basically, and how quickly it'll get to a state where it can be harvested as a resource for making construction timber. Unfortunately, I suspect an awful lot more of it is just going for pulp, for paper, and maybe some's going for wood fuel pellets. But yeah, it's a big resource in southwest Scotland. I think the statistic is something like about 70% of Scotland's timber is produced in southwest Scotland. It's really important to the local economy, and in the resurgence at the moment. When we get a bit higher up, we'll be able to see a few more features of the landscape. But basically, we're walking up through a farm, up onto the top. So onward and upward. So where we are at the moment is as good a place as any to view the heap of stones over there, which is actually the Carnaval Neolithic burial mound, which dates, because it's Neolithic, it's probably up to about 7,000 years old, considerably robbed for walling stone, was an awful lot bigger in its heyday, 7,000-ish years ago. And Neolithic in form, it's a really long oval, and was about 120 feet wide at its widest once upon a time. And an interesting form of burial in that they were chambered burials within that mound of stones, but they weren't actually burying you in one piece. They were burying your bones. They'd probably have, back in those, burial customs were very different in those days. Bodies would have been commonly dismembered, stripped of flesh, and the bones laid to rest in the chamber in the cairn. And I suppose that relates to some customs that still persist in Europe today. The notion of an ossuary, where people spend a few years drying out and decomposing, and then the last remnants are just put in a cupboard in an ossuary, basically. So yeah, and that's really the first the first significant monument on this route. When we get higher up, you'll be able to see a bit more of how the landscape works, and I can point out a few other interesting aspects. But you know, so a Neolithic burial mound, which in terms of size and scale was the village cemetery of its day. You know, so there's been, and you will see, if you wander around that area, you'll see the outlines of other buildings as well around it. So it would have been an important site locally, because it, you know, it's such a large cairn. Anyway, right, on we go. Small point of interest here, folks. This is what you see in front of you now is actually the first, probably, I'll preface that, probably the first example of the original road surface. It was essentially surfaced with a mix of compacted crushed stone. And we've found remnants of that same surface all the way along this route right to Polmaddy. So it wasn't just a boggy mess over the moors. It was actually a properly surfaced road by the standards of the day, and that's what it looks like when you dig down. This is probably 1600s from that sort of period. It, you know, I think as you know, if the archaeologists are right, it started off as a ridgeway, and I'll point out the cairns as we get higher up. Then became essentially a pack road. Wheeled vehicles weren't that common, you know, because wheeled vehicles don't work very well in this sort of terrain. So basically trains of pack ponies that were carrying goods, and people on foot or rich people on horseback. This was part of the this area was part of the Garrick estate, which is an estate that the remnants are still hanging on down at New Galloway. Does anybody know Garrick Glen? Right, so that's the core of what's left of the estate, of that estate. The Garrick estate must have been absolutely huge, because it included all of this. So the Garrick estate obviously sold this patch of land off in the 1920s, and at that stage, up until the First World War, when there was a great reckoning in how the estates were going to be managed and land was going to be managed, this was a shooting estate, hence the grouse butts. And we'll see, yeah, we'll get a better view when we're a little bit higher up, but there are actually two lines of grouse butts across just this small section of the moor, which, so the birds would have been, and grouse are all wild. Grouse are never reared for shooting because they never survive very long if they're artificially reared. You can rear them artificially. But so beaters would have driven great coveys of grouse over guns who were in the butts. Right. Excellent. Up the hill. There's a really nice example of a grouse butt hiding in the bracken here. So just a circular dry stone enclosure, big enough to fit the gentleman shooter and his loader in. Wee entrance at the back, and so because the entrance is at the back, obviously they're low down, just their heads and shoulders peeking up above the dyke. The birds were driven up this way. There is a whole line of them here, which we'll be able to see when I hide up the brackens. Bracken's a bit high at the moment. Right, folks, pause for archaeological update. What you've got in front of you is a lovely example of a Bronze Age cairn, which is probably 3,000 to 4,000 years old. Any suspicious pile of stones around here is a cairn. There's one just up there, there's one across there. They're all over the landscape here. And that's why the archaeologists think that, they were significant enough in terms of quantity and location for this to have been a prehistoric ridgeway. and a Ridgeway, so named for the simple reason that when you were travelling, you kept to the high ground because it gave you the best view of who will be coming to kill you or eat you. So I was saying to Kristen, why walk this route when you can have the lovely gentle route of the A713 today? And the answer was, this was all there was, and at the time was the safest route. So yeah, spot the cairn. There are some bigger ones up on the top which we don't actually see, but again, the big ones, constructed of big piles of smaller stones, have been heavily robbed for diking. But you can still see the outline of them. There's a lovely one up there which, as a dike, goes straight through the middle of it, and it's a big one, it's probably 40 foot across, two lovely circles of stone about that high with the dike running through the middle. So an early form of recycling. So we're at the edge of the march boundary of Carnaval Farm now. We're going on to an area of ground which is owned by a company called Chernin-Kinsky Scottish company, who Count Chernin-Kinsky, it doesn't sound very Scottish, no, that's because Count Chernin-Kinsky isn't. So this area within the past 2 years, and I think there's something about 800 acres, something like that, is all now planted up with the inevitable Sitka spruce, hence the deer fence. So in 10 years' time, you'll be walking through a lovely woodland walk. For the moment, we're walking across open moorland. So, there's a huge debate about this, but, the point I made earlier on about there being no forestry, no trees in 1905 in this area, we've only got to look over there, and most of it is actually trees. And again, it's all Sitka spruce by and large. So from one bit of landscape still being farmed in a fairly rugged way to the modern face of forestry. Silviculture, good. So the next bit of path is the made up bit of path that was properly constructed. It's on an authentic line, and I know that because I was down on my hands and knees prodding and poking to find the original road surface. But when we first built it, I was a bit dismayed because it looks like we've built a motorway across the moor. It's mellowed a bit now, but at least it provides a route which is walkable. Right, so I mentioned at the start about Christian artifacts and the significance of this route as a pilgrim's route. There is a somewhere up here there is a chapel. The archaeologists know about it by record, but it's never been found. But we can go and have a quick look at the so-called cross flags, which are basically rudimentary carved crosses. So right, off piste, up the hill. So this is essentially a pile of part worked cross markers. Nobody really knows what they were for, whether they were way markers for pilgrims or whether they were rudimentary gravestones or what. And the markings on them do take some interpretation, but if you spot lines, you'll see sort of cross shafts and rudimentary Celtic crosses on there with a central boss. And the one here that is probably the easiest to interpret. So you can see the two lines of the cross shaft there, and then you can see a central boss there, and you can see the arms coming off here. That's the best example. But these are 8th or 9th century in origin, according to experts in cross type. So I mean, you know, the architecture, archaeology around here is so prolific that, you know, it's never been, you know, comprehensively excavated or explored. I mean, I've found lines of stones which are essentially prehistoric enclosures. And you fall across them, you stumble over them, and then you stumble over another one further up, and you think, oh, there's a line of these stones. They're not a wall within historical memory, they're just a line of something which was probably somebody's enclosure outside the hut. This was a far busier landscape as well, you know, thousands of years ago, because it was probably a lot warmer then. You know, there is still the remnants of scattered farmsteadings all over the moors here. Some of them are buried in forestry, but there were a lot of people living and working up here. So we cheated with this bit of path. I was just saying we cheated with this bit of path. The historic route runs alongside that wood against a dike, but it just so happened that Glenkens Forestry were putting in a track. So I saved about 500 metres of path construction.
And money.
And money. This is the junction at which I had to start spending money again. Right. So this takes us down to the march boundary of the Glenkens ground. So, Kirsten, that way. And somewhere down to the right, there is the remains of an old farmstead, which is visible from the path. So we're walking on what was the most technically challenging bit of path to build. This is the authentic route of the pack road, but it had been planted, forested, and then clear felled, and completely obliterated the path. It hadn't completely obliterated the path but it had completely obliterated it as a route that you could walk across. You literally needed either waders or bin bags up to your knees to cross it, and then you would probably get a broken leg anyway. But it's very difficult. So we ended up building a path which is essentially floating on a bog. So this is a really interesting part of the path. If you walk through here, you know, when it's damp and the sun's shining, it can be magical with mists and the sun shining through the trees. But you'll see original path surface as well. This is, for the most part, is it, because what we actually did here was basically just scrape the gutter and muck off the top and ditched it to drain it better. So you're seeing a lot of original path surface on this section. And you'll also see that basically all these trees were planted on what 100 years ago was an agricultural landscape. So you'll see, you know, dikes, dike ends, corners, and you'll see, I'll point out there's a building further along here. And so a lot of these were, you know, for travellers 150 years ago. A lot of these, you know, little steadings would have been points of refuge in bad weather. And you'll see across there, you'll see the old stone dikes, which were originally, you know, farming enclosures. And you'll spot quite a lot of it intersecting the path or running alongside of the path on this section. And I'll point out anything of interest as we go. Right, onward. actually this is the remains of a building. That we're at an interesting point here. That wee promontory there is bedrock, but there are 4 dikes. The remains of 4 dikes join up at that point, which again is agricultural division of whatever. And just down in here there is the remains of an old farmsteading building. So it's just, you know, just interesting little artefacts that have survived the devastation of Sitka forestry. Right folks, so we've driven our pack train over the tops. We set off sometime in the morning. It's been a howling gale, blizzards, etc, over the top, and we get down here, which is the edge of the Polmaddy site. And this, as I said, was a quite a, you know, 200 plus years ago. Well, 300 years ago, was a thriving industrial complex with a mill, 5 drying kilns, and a lot of agriculture going on, quite a few houses, and a pub. It is really unusual from the point of view of a farm town. It's probably the best surviving ruin of a farm town in southwest Scotland, and probably the only one with a pub. And the pub was called Netherward, which I love because it's the name straight out of Lord of the Rings. So again, we're still on the authentic route of the pack road. So the pub, Netherward. It hasn't served a pint of beer for a long time. The settlement of Polmaddy really ceased as a viable going concern in the very early 1800s, by which time the A713 was in use and taking most of the traffic. But I love the fact it has a name and that we know the name.
Yes.
It's worthwhile spending a bit of time wandering around to see the various ruins. But that, as I said, it had a mill. The mill where that alder or whatever it is there, the mill was at that point, and above the path, above the main path, you can actually see the outline of a mill pond. And if you go to the ruin that tree is in the middle of and look at the bottom wall, you can actually see, I think it was probably an overshot mill wheel, but you can actually see where the bearing shafts fitted into the wall if you go and look closely enough. So quite a big mill, 5 drying kilns, a good few houses, and so the path itself carried on straight down, tracked the bank of the burn, and then forded the burn about where that clearing is between 2 trees, and then carries straight on up the hill. It's been completely obliterated by forestry. I cannot find it, but if you can see the March Dyke at the top.
Yeah.
All you've got to do is pop your head over the March Dyke at approximately the right place, and lo and behold, the depression of the pack road carries on across the moor. Right everybody, and appreciate I'm probably taxing you a bit here, but what do you think of the bridge? Is there anything unusual about it? Apart from the fact it's narrow. About 30 or 40 years ago, the Forestry Commission bought a lot of dismantled television antenna sections, and they decided, obviously with the express intention of using them to build bridges. So in time this will become a listed structure in its own right, and they're known as aerial bridges because they are built from bits of old aerial antenna. Hence the funny shape and the narrow section. So here we are back at the Carsphairn War Memorial. We've walked a really interesting route today. We've seen a changing upland landscape. We've seen from afar, admittedly, the Woodhead lead mine. A lot of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Neolithic archaeology, and we've found the mythical cross flags on the back of Bredennock Hill. And seeing how forestry has changed the landscape over the last 100 years from one of primarily agricultural small farming settlements to mass Sitka spruce plantations. We had a quick look at the Polmaddy farm town, and that's where we're going to do our next walk from, over the top down to Dalry.